Talking about Linus, or rather Linus as it is pronounced in Italian, is relevant to the key issues of this conference, economies of time and space, competition and transfer, from many different perspectives: historical, cultural and translational. First is the time and space of its appearance. Milan, 1st of April 1965. Milan was a very modern city with a booming economy, an equally thriving cultural life, and a brand new readership of middle-class people could spend on non-essential goods such as books and comics, which explains the possibility of putting an expensive magazine on the market. The price of Linus was 300 liras, while most other magazines cost between 50 and 150 liras. It was in the wake of the success made by the translations of Peanuts all over Europe that Giovanni Gandini and his wife, Anna Maria Gregorietti, acquired the right of publishing Schultz comics from the United Feature Syndicate. In 1962, the bookshop in Via Verdi had also become a publishing house, Milano Libri, and they first published the stories of Charlie Brown and his mates in book form in 1963 and 1964. The idea of printing a comics and illustration magazine as the subheading of Linus read was born from the conversations of a group of intellectuals, Umberto Eco, Elio Vittorini and Oreste Del Buono, who met in Gandini's bookshop. These were focused on something that they considered very important and serious, even if apparently frivolous: Charlie Brown's comics. In those same years, Umberto Eco in Apocalypse Postponed claimed that comics, though a product of mass culture, were not merely a form of children's entertainment, which adults could experience as a cheap, harmless way to evade from humdrum reality, comfortably sitting in their armchairs after dinner. He defines the experience of reading comics as a spell, which beats the routine of consumption and evasion and verges on meditation. As Interdonato claims, the idea behind Linus was quite simple: creating a magazine devoted to comics, generally considered ephemeral commodities, since their short life coincides with their presence at the newsagents, long enough to wrap fish in, as Al Cap, the creator of Lille Abner, had ironically remarked in one of his articles, especially since the power of comics, as highlighted by Eco, derives from the reiteration of experience. A short daily or weekly story, a traditional strip, even if it tells a self-contained event in 4 vignettes, does not work on its own, but requires every flavor only in the continuous and stubborn sequence that unfolds, strip after strip, day by day. A magazine entirely devoted to comics could be the ideal format for this kind of experience, a world you could enter and get lost in. In the first issue of Linus, editor and translator Franco Cavallone defines Peanuts as an uninterrupted poem, and the magazine itself as an endless conversation with the reader. From this perspective, comics seem to transcend the contingencies of time and space and appeal to universal values and habits. On the other hand, historical awareness was an integral part of the experiment and all-pervasively felt in the pages of Linus. The editors constantly look forward and backward to the history of comics. The intent was neither utopian nor archaeological. The magazine was firmly set in the present time. Both the rather mild appreciation for science fiction comics and the retrospective views were based on the artistic quality of the comics and on their capacity to reflect the present time. The approach was diachronic and philological. The editors themselves, summing up the first year of the magazine in December 1965, defined themselves as Lombard philologists. Historical and philological rigor served two purposes. It legitimized comics as a genre belonging to a long tradition and underlined the asynchronies between the appearance of comic strips in American newspapers at the end of the 19th century and full affirmation in the first decades of the 20th, and their reluctant acceptance by the Italian publishing world until the post-war period. In an article on the great Italian cartoonist Antonio Rubino, Lino Albertarelli reported that in 1908, while comics were thriving in American newspapers, il Corriere dei Piccoli published fumetti senza fumetti, comics without balloons. In the translation process from the original American version to the Italian one, the comics had been maimed, deprived of the trait that represented their novelty. In fact, the speech bubbles, which were considered non-educational as they would allegedly have discouraged children from reading the text, had been replaced by captions containing 2 rhyming couplets. The first balloons would appear in Corriere dei Piccoli no sooner than in 1961. The only outstanding exception in the Italian scenery has been il Politecnico, founded by Elio Vittorini, which in 1945 gave ample space to the visual arts, and particularly to American comics. With all this, we read in editorial in issue 5, the cartoon genre remains a rather neglected phenomenon in Italy, quite the opposite of what happens in England, the United States, France, where apart from the great journalistic tradition of illustrated satire, above all political satire, magazines thrive almost entirely entrusted to the quality, style and spirit of the cartoons they publish. Think of the famous New Yorker, the authentic Great Academy of the cartoon, the Saturday Evening Post, Esquire, Punch, Playboy, Louis. However, the 1960s saw an increasing interest in comics by the academic and artistic world, also in Italy. Between February and March 1965, less than 2 months before the appearance of Linus, the first international exhibition of comics was held in Bordighera, organized by the Institute of Education of the University of Rome, the Center for Sociology of Mass Communications, and the Centre d'études de littérature d'expression graphique, which was later, fortunately, renamed the Club de Bande Dessinée. Special guest of the event was the famous cartoonist Al Cap. This is how the cover page of Life's International Edition illustrates the event. Al Cap among Europe's intellectuals, a hilarious account by the cartoonist. The article itself ironically commented on this crusade for comics headed by Umberto Eco and the French film director Alain Resnais. Moving from time to space, there is first of all space of the magazine, and that space is a limited one. Linus had 64 pages. Despite the large staple format, in issue 4 Gandini had already to announce the first supplement, which would actually be published in October. In fact, Gandini's idea was to put the world into a magazine. I will never forget the pleasure of having a magazine and the possibility of saying everything in it so that I could claim I said it before everyone else. This explains why, behind the minimalist, perfect design of the cover page, Linus was crammed with all sorts of things: editorials, comics, readers' letters, surveys, games, ads, reviews, a history of comics, and from issue 4, an encyclopedia of comics. However, despite the limited space, Linus was conceived as an open magazine, in the sense of open to its readership. The reader was constantly involved in the making of the magazine. Did they like such and such comics? Did they like games? Did they want Linus to become a fortnightly, etc.? The editors promptly provided feedback in the next issue. Conversely, the making of the reader was partly the responsibility of the magazine. Here we enter the space of translation. As Spinelli remarks, the reader is informed about the cultural and linguistic difficulties inherent in the translation of published works, or the problem of the use of stories that refer to specific aspects of American politics, observed through time and space, and consumed by a historically or ideologically dissimilar public. The intellectuals who gathered around Linus witnessed a recontextualization of society and power. The geographical, political, and cultural space of the comics could not easily be overlooked. As Rota argues, having graphic elements that cannot be modified by translation, comics are an artistic form that reveals more than others the foreign origin of the works. According to Vittorini, comics are complex microcosms full of surprises. In Linus, each new strip is introduced as a world, at once geographically located and vague. Pogo's Ocafenokee swamp, for example, actually on the border between Georgia and Florida, is defined by translator Bruno Cavallone as the temple of all the quintessentially American myths and traditions, and socially speaking, the most atypical and abstract place that you may conceive. Yet, it would be deceiving to think that comics as product of mass culture which support shared myths and values can undergo a sort of neutral translation, at once self-determining and determined by human nature, individualistic yet generic, transcending cultural difference, cause social conflict and historical change. As argued by Goethe and reported by Venuti, there are two maxims in translation. One requires that the author of a foreign nation be brought across to us in such a way that we can look on him as ours. The other requires that we should go across to what is foreign and adapt ourselves to its conditions, its use of language, its peculiarities. In other words, every translation entails a degree of domestication and foreignization. Domestication privileges immediate recognition in the target culture. It aims to interpret the source text in terms that are intelligible and interesting in the receiving situation. Foreignization, by contrast, does not seem to privilege immediate recognition. However, according to Venuti, even foreignization is a construction overdetermined by the receiving situation. It is not the foreignness of the source text itself, but rather a foreignism that is moreover subject to variation depending on the changing cultural situations and historical moments of various interpreters and translators. As part of Linus' ambitious cultural project, there was indeed the need to domesticate a language and the socio-cultural context with which Italian readers were just then becoming familiar. As Interdonato remarks, the magazine itself was since its appearance an alien body grafted onto the papers on display in the homeland newsstands. Gradual acclimatization was an integral part of the editorial project, even the graphic one. In issue 2, for example, the first colored plates of Peanuts appeared to allow children to familiarize more easily with Schultz's characters. In the introductory sections to each comic strip, and sometimes in the footnotes, the characters and the way they speak, culture-specific and political references, Roosevelt, McCarthyism, Kennedy's presidency, the contention of third world countries by the two superpowers, the Japanese threat as America's economic competitor, all are explained to the reader, along with the problems encountered in the translation. Foreignization, education to otherness was also part of the project. For example, the headlines contained many English words, as this was probably also considered more appealing for an Italian reader. We find some comic strips in the original language, and from issue 4, a tour of the world section to present to the Italian public those comics that they do not yet know, to promptly reveal new discoveries from all over the world, to keep them informed on what is happening and said in this field. Finally, as Venuti concludes, foreignizing translation is not its orientation toward or adherence to the source text, but rather the translator's command and application of certain linguistic and cultural resources in the receiving situation. In fact, the translation of comics poses not only cultural but also technical and linguistic challenges. First, the translation has to fit in the speech bubbles, which can be a problem for Italian words, usually longer than the English ones. Then there are the technical constraints of a multimodal medium. They need to take into account the interaction of the verbal and visual code, the kinesics and proxemics visually represented. In addition to this, onomatopoeia, sound effects and symbols, the rhythm of the strips. The translator has to consider all the functions that are performed by fictional dialogue: characterization, narrative and expository function, contextualization, the exploitation of the resources of language, and control of viewer evaluation and emotions. Among the resources of language, not only onomatopoeia, but also non-standard varieties of the language, both existing and invented ones. Finally, stylistic elements of writing, such as lettering, typography, and fonts, as well as what has been called para or quasi-ballonic phenomena, which are incorporated in a dialogue scene. Indeed, the brothers Franco and Bruno Cavallone, editors and translators of Linus, could only resort to the mastery of stylistic strategies and to a gamut of lexical and grammatical devices that belong to the Italian language. And this entails that the translation of comics had inevitably to be a form of adaptation or transcreation. Comic strip posed different challenges. With regard to Peanuts, for example, in the first issue of Linus, Bruno Cavallone introduces, along with the characters, also cultural references, namely the celebration of Halloween, in a footnote in the same page. The rituals were somehow similar to those of the All Saints, but the translator was aware of the cultural differences between the Italian and American context. He also explains linguistic choices. The use of cocomero, watermelon, instead of zucca, pumpkin, is explained by the need, according to him, to find a name whose gender was male, as the great pumpkin stood for a godlike male figure. We have many other examples of domestication. Marshmallows, which were not popular among Italian children at the time, as they are now, became toffolette, little toffees. Instead of eating figgy pudding, Snoopy complains about the panettone. Other culture-specific references are domesticated too. Instead of writing Another Heart of Darkness or Daisy Miller, Snoopy might have become Tomasi di Lampedusa and authored The Leopard, which was at the time the epitome of fame for Italian readers, also because of the recent success of Visconti's films. When introducing Lilo Abner, Cavallone explained that the language of the Yoacoms is an ungrammatical and unruly American English, in which words are written as they are pronounced, but according to a very peculiar pronunciation. The translation of the episode is the first experiment that will define the possibility of rendering those distortions in Italian. Following the principle of the reader's acclimatization, the translation of the strips actually becomes more and more daringly experimental in the following issues of Linus. Cat by George Herriman is defined as one of the most poetic comics ever. The idiolect and idiosyncrasies of Crazy Cat, the southern drawl mixed with African-American vernacular sounds, are reproduced in Italian by replacing vowels and consonants, for instance A with E, and R, which in Italian is a dental vibrant, with labiodental fricative V, prima, instead of prima, as you can read in this slide. Glides are also used. Finally, Pogo. Cavallone argues that some comics can have different interpretations, but a comic strip like Pogo can only have one, and that one is certainly not easy. He describes Pogo as extremely complex, difficult to define in a few words, a Baroque artwork, which has to be slowly and painstakingly assimilated before you can start appreciating it. A lot of text crammed in the balloons, a strange variety of American English where characters freely invent their paradigms, bring, brung, come, and auxiliaries are used interchangeably, while the third-person singular is used for all persons. All this sometimes matched to a very formal register, a multitude of minor characters speaking distinct idiolects and varieties of English, Scottish, Irish, Australian English, which he bravely decided to translate without resorting to Italian dialects, as was instead usually the case in Italy at the time. Different jargons of politics, sports, advertising, and each jargon with a different font. The senator speaks in Gothic, the circus agent in fin de siècle font full of flowers, indexes, stars, and comets. Word plays, tongue twisters, alliterative poetry, acrobatic language, rhetorical language, the character's tendency to communicate through monologues or non-dialogues that resemble those of Ionesco, Shakespeare, and Lewis Carroll. Of all this wealth, he concludes, the unfortunate translator can obviously retain only the crumbs. This actually led to a debate among intellectuals about the possibility or impossibility of translating comics of such complexity. Al Capi himself, in his article in Life, ironically wrote about this intellectual quarrel about his own language, which had been compared to that of Finnegan's Wake. Yet, all these arguments are a sign of the importance given to the translation issue in Linus. Despite the loss of meaning and expressivity, the crumbs, the creative process inherent to that adaptation at the core of the project of the magazine. The editorial in the December issue, which introduces the strips of Mickey Mouse, but also sums up the first year of Linus, says, "Benvenuti a Città Aerea, welcome to a city," one of the happy phrases and names, fruit of the imagination of translators as well as of Walt Disney's inventions. After all, the name of the magazine had been chosen not only because it was easy to remember, but also because Linus Van Pelt is a nice creative character who paints in the air. Thank you very much for your attention.